We have actually rolled out this robust decision making in Latin America and the Caribbean in multiple countries. So one of the first countries that rolled out the robust decision making to develop a long-term strategy that was submitted to the UNFCCC was Costa Rica. So this report that we developed with the colleagues from the Inter-American Development Bank and the RAM Corporation USA uh, actually shows that Costa Rica, if moves away from fossil fuels, has the potential to bring to the economy of the country 41 billion uh, in net benefits. So this is on top of the cost of doing the transition of moving away from fossil fuels. We can actually save 41 billion dollars by 2050. The report is publicly available and is in English, so I invite you to have a look at that. We did a similar analysis in Peru. This report is in Spanish, though, and we actually found that if Peru moves away from the current economy, they go to a net zero by 2050, they have the potential to reach $140 billion in net benefit. Other countries like Chile and have found that 5% of the GDP could be obtained if they explore these uncertainties and plan robust strategies by 2050, while also achieving net zero by mid-century. Quite recently, in November last year, the Inter-American Development Bank and the 2050 Pathways Platform, in collaboration with the RAND Corporation and colleagues from the Monterrey Technological of Monterrey in Mexico, developed this regional analysis for the whole Latin American region. And they actually found that 2.7 trillion of dollars could be obtained by 2050 if the region pursues a net zero by mid-century. There are ongoing works currently in Latin America and the Caribbean, such as Ecuador, Guatemala, Jamaica, and Dominican Republic, that are rolling out this methodology. And many more countries are currently requesting this support to Inter-American Development Bank, World Bank, and other funders in the region. So provided that the complexity of each country may change, may be different, if we go to the next slide, then quite recently, actually today, has been made available this robust decision-making guide to develop long-term strategies. So provided that we have identified that many circumstances can change in a country, and based on the Latin American case studies that I was mentioning before, we put this robust decision-making guide that will help practitioners to navigate the challenges of planning by 2050 or 2070, 2060. So this methodology or this robust decision-making guide, I'm going to share the link right now in the chat, so you can actually look at the guide that has been made available today, just a couple of hours ago, precisely for this workshop. So we are launching this guide in this webinar. You can actually download it and find that one, it was co-created with multiple experts in the field, from governments, from multilateral development banks and academia, and also practitioners that have rolled out robust decision-making in multiple countries. This guide aims to support the development of resilient long-term strategies by also informing short-term actions that can actually be put in the next cycle of NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, that countries are called to submit by February or by June next year. Also, it calls for an alignment of NDCs and LTS, provided that the NDCs are a step forward the next LTS. It's a 10-step guide, so it expands on the 5-step methodology that I previously presented, and it goes step by step, indicating activities, tips, and goals of every single step based on best practices in Latin America and the Caribbean. If we move to the next slide, one of the reasons why we were putting together this robust decision-making guide is because we know that it is a very powerful tool to manage deep uncertainties in long-term planning. So long-term planning is very challenging. We have to explore multiple scenarios by 2050, 2070. It also helps informing short-term actions by identifying those actions today that will be beneficial in the future. It also increases ownership as it engages closely with multiple stakeholders and can actually support the mobilization of funds. In fact, if we move to the next slide, in this 10-step methodology or 10-step guide, we will navigate through every single step and present the challenges that we have encountered in different applications in Latin America and the Caribbean that have been documented in this guide that is publicly available, as mentioned before. And maybe just to conclude and pass it on to my colleagues, this approach, which is embedded within the Data to Deal framework that the Climate Compatible Growth Program has been developing, has mobilized a large amount of climate finance in Latin America and the Caribbean. So in total, countries like Costa Rica, Chile, Dominican Republic, and Uruguay have mobilized a total of more than $10 billion in climate finance because of the transparency, because of the modeling tools, transparent data that is used, and also the exploration of multiple scenarios that we do. And also that engagement with multiple stakeholders create this ownership in the country that then allows multiple countries to go to the different investors and request different funds to actually deliver the strategy that the countries are developing. So I'm going to stop there and pass it on to my colleague, Professor Steve Pai, so he can present some case studies as well. Steve.
Thank you very much, Jairo. If you could move to the next slide. Just to say, while we're waiting for the slide to change, yeah, really good to be here and just really excited to be talking about this approach, which I see real value in. And I think the point of my intervention here is to kind of contrast it with kind of what we've been doing. Well, some of what we've been doing in terms of more sort of classical scenario approach, and think about the kind of benefits that this RDM approach can bring in terms of thinking through longer term futures. So I just start with this slide, which is really just setting out the fact that we all know that there are many, many multiple uncertainties in energy and transport system planning that take account of multiple domains, whether that be techno-economic, socio-technical, or socio-political. All of these different aspects of planning are intertwined and make for a very sort of complicated world. And thinking about the future, of course, is and dealing with all this uncertainty is super difficult. But of course, we need it in terms of policy planning and so that we can think about the right outcomes. And I think RDM helps us do that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so yeah, we have this issue of uncertainty avoidance and a lot of modeling work. This reference from 1990 says, you know, historically, the most common approach to uncertainty in policy analysis has been to ignore it. And I think there's a level of truth in that still even today. Of course, I'm not totally dissing scenarios, you know, the more discrete narrative-based scenarios, because I use them a lot, but often we see that they don't provide sufficient coverage of the uncertainty space. And then when we're using things like optimization modeling, that further pushes us into, you know, a specific set of narrower options. So yeah, I think, you know, RDM helps us sort of push back on that and explore a wider space. I mean, why do we have this issue of avoidance? I mean, it's really because there's a sense that thinking about uncertainty is a bad fit for the policy process, too difficult to manage all of those different worlds. It can be contentious, you know, moving into space that actually policymakers don't feel particularly comfortable about. It's difficult to parameterize so people think, and of course there's complexity in terms of modeling it. So I think that's kind of why we end up in this space. Okay, so next slide. So this is really about like my sense of how RDM can address some of these things. I think, as Jairo has pointed out, it's a really good fit for the policy process, in the sense that decision makers do want to think about uncertainty. The question more for them is how they do that. It allows for that kind of consideration of a range of different policy criteria. We're not just thinking about one policy objective, we're thinking about multiple ones and multiple priorities. And this approach can really embed that into the thinking. And one of the things I love about RDM is that it forces participatory approach to modeling. You know, that is embedded in that 10-step process that Jairo showed. So it is a good fit. I think the other thing that I've sort of thought about is that it can obscure some of the contentious issues. Because we're generating so many scenarios, we can think about things such as economic downturn or policy failure that would actually be very difficult to kind of model within a kind of discrete set of a narrower, smaller set of discrete scenarios. So, you know, those sort of, you know, more tricky topics, should we say, can be incorporated. And we can also think within that of kind of preferred options and how they, you know, if a policymaker already has a scenario that they're banking on, that can be tested against this broader range. So I think it's very useful for that. Of course, it helps with that issue of capturing uncertainty. Doesn't necessarily need, you know, probability distribution functions. You know, it's kind of away from that kind of approach of trying to parameterize uncertainty in a more detailed way. And it's more it is more complex, but I think some of the stuff that Jairo's been doing with the guidebook, and in respect of some of the work that's going on in the CCG program to really kind of get these kind of approaches and tools out there will hopefully make it more accessible. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to reflect on a couple of examples that I have been involved in or will be or are currently involved in. So this was one, again, back in Latin America. There's a theme here about the kind of proliferation of this approach in that region. But we did this study in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank, looking at oil and gas revenues for producers in Latin America. Again, of course, very hot topic, very contentious, really asking the question about what is the robustness of you know, strategies for oil production going into the future. So we started off by embracing this method, or part of the method, should I say, by firstly looking at the kind of like uncertainty around global oil demand. So that's the right-hand box that shows the kind of spread of different scenarios under more optimistic and less optimistic cases in view of oil production. And then we basically explored, you know, given this uncertainty, what are we focusing on in terms of priority? So this was about ensuring that public revenues from oil production could be understood in view of this uncertainty and could potentially be protected. So we're looking at things like, you know, how do different fiscal regimes in different countries help protect or attract investment into this space, given the uncertainty around oil futures. So yeah, so that was the kind of story. You know, so we captured this wide set of uncertainties, explored, I think, what is a sensitive topic, particularly in the climate space, in what we felt was a much more scientifically objective way. Came up with some very clear messaging on the need for diversification strategies and a sense that there are limited levers to prolong production under a range of futures through fiscal regime type approaches. So that's one example from a couple of years back. Next slide. Yeah, so one of the current efforts is working with stakeholders and partners in Kenya, looking at power sector power system planning, thinking about, well, we've done some scenario work. Can we think a little bit more about broader uncertainties and what that means to the pathways that we've been focusing on, to think about robustness? Clearly, a lot of key uncertainties around planning on, what will be the outturn electricity demand in the future, what's going to be the role of different generation technologies based on their performance or their cost or whatever else. To what extent is the system going to be centralized, decentralized? How is climate going to impact all of this? What about the sort of external factors like fossil fuel prices? So a lot of uncertainty here. So what we're doing is working with our partners to kind of explore some of this using the RDM approach. Clearly, I also want to just reflect on a few of the challenges. I mean, it can be a challenging approach. Who do you decide to participate in the process? To what extent do you expand your model coverage to include other sectors beyond the power sector? And then, how do you build in that capacity of this kind of approach? And again, I think, some of the work that HYRA has been doing and others in terms of getting this method out there will help in that regard. I'll probably stop there. I see time is running on, and hand over to Will. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Will Usher, and I'm based at KTH and lead the platform in climate compatible growth. So yeah, I'm going to complement the talks from HYRA and Steve just with a slightly more deeper dive into these methods. And these, I'm going to present results from two papers, basically. The first is applying this sort of RDM framework. I'm calling it a DMDU method, so that's a decision making under deep uncertainty. And this is an umbrella organization association which brings together a range of methods dealing with deep uncertainty, and RDM is one of those. Sorry, Lara, I've just lost the slides. I'll keep talking anyway. And then the second paper is about sensitivity analysis and applying sensitivity analysis to really understand how energy system models work. So see, Lara's having some technical issues. Okay, we can see the slides now, Lara, so that's good. So the first study is about this biomass CCS plant that's being planned to be built in Stockholm, and this is a district heating plant. So at the moment, it consumes a lot of biomass and produces heat and electricity, and that heat is then fed into the district heating network. So the problem that the company was interested in is, should they invest in this CCS plant? And what are the kind of conditions, the vulnerabilities, the risks, but also the opportunities for the company? And so Oscar, who's the main author of this publication, did a deep analysis into this that covered sort of two methodological approaches. One is using dynamic adaptive pathways and sort of interviews, so it was more of a qualitative approach. And then he also created a simple sort of techno-economic model of this plant, and I'll show the results of those in a moment. But basically, by adding the carbon capture and storage, a bit of kit to this plant, you obtain two things. Firstly, you get a new revenue stream from selling negative emission credits, and also the ratio of heat to electricity changed. So a lot more heat was generated than electricity, and that sort of changed the economics of the plant, and sort of changed really the sort of business model or how it would be operated. So all of this needed to be sort of modeled. Next slide, Laura. So so we conducted a whole load of interviews with various stakeholders and followed this dynamic adaptive pathways approach, where you select vulnerability, or you identify vulnerabilities and opportunities. So these are things which could, hinder the successful operation and investment of the plant, or actually lead to a more profitable outcome. And then 79 adaptive actions, which would help mitigate these vulnerabilities or allow the company to take advantage of these opportunities. And then these were categorized into political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and regulatory categories. So on the next slide, I'll give just one example, and that's a vulnerability. So in this case, it's biomass practices of upstream biomass could be classified as non-renewable or non-sustainable by the EU. So this is like an external factor which the company really has no ability to influence, but the actions are things that they can actually do, and the signposts are then the information that they need to sort of monitor. So in this case, they should follow sort of ongoing discussions with the forestry sector, monitor levels of other economic incentives, and so on. And then the actions allow them to then try and mitigate this particular vulnerability. Okay, next slide. Then in terms of the quantitative modeling, we created a simple model and then run 100,000 scenarios where we just looked at a range of outcomes across around 30 parameters, uncertain parameters. And these parameters were all mapped then to these opportunities and vulnerabilities where possible from the first piece of the work, this dynamic adaptive pathways. So what we see here on the plot on the left is the mean selling price of CO2 emissions, and then a quantification of the regret. So this is the sort of missed profits that the company would be exposed to by not investing. And so you can see here that there's a sort of range, a broad pattern where if CO2 prices are low, then you're more likely to experience some regret. But if CO2 prices are high, then the plant is more likely to be profitable, and there's less likelihood of regret. Sorry, just back on the previous slide, Lara. So on the right-hand side, we then see a sensitivity, or the results of a sensitivity analysis. And this shows what are called the first, second, and total order sensitivity indices. Basically, the bigger the circle, the more important or influential that input is for the output. Because of this approach, these parameters are all sort of tied to those vulnerabilities and opportunities that we saw earlier. So here we can see that the total influence of the year in which negative emission credits can be claimed and traded, that's the most important parameter, but it's closely linked via this grey line. So it closely interacts then with the average electricity price and the year of biomass restrictions. So the sensitivity analysis here gives a real indication of the structure of the model and the relationship between these parameters. And that helps explain some of the results, which we see on the next slide. So once we had these 100,000 scenarios, the question is, well, what on earth do you do with this much data? And the scenario analysis, RDM approach, there are numerous tools which allow you to implement this, and here we implemented an algorithm called CART, and this allows you to divide up the output space of the model and to search it to identify areas in that output space of the model which are desirable. So here are two examples. On the left-hand side, we see an area of low regret, and these are scenarios where there are low electricity prices, and then the years in which the negative emission credits are available they're available fairly early on. And on the right-hand side, we see an area of high regret, And this is a situation in which there's high average electricity prices and carbon credits are only available much later on in the investment period. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so to summarize this, I've got a reference to the paper later if you're interested in reading more, but the results from this analysis sort of gave insights into whether the company should invest and wait. And it wasn't just a sort of yes or no answer, but we could identify the conditions under which they would invest and identify, you know, the missed opportunity basically of not investing. And so basically we said that you know, investing performs better in, you know, just over half of these futures that we explored, but by waiting, then they experience, you know, twice the regret of investing. And so that on balance then leads to a recommendation to invest. We also showed that there was a real nice sort of interaction between the quantitative modeling and then this qualitative aspect where the interviews and the application of the dynamic adaptive pathways led really nicely into that modeling. And the sensitivity analysis helped identify, you know, which were the key sort of vulnerabilities and opportunities where these could be identified or quantified. And on the next slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about sensitivity analysis. Often there's confusion about what sensitivity analysis is and how it relates to uncertainty analysis. So just quickly, uncertainty analysis is when you propagate uncertainty through the model. So you have uncertain inputs and then you do something like a Monte Carlo analysis and you get some kind of distribution or quantification of uncertainty in the outputs. But the question arises, you know, what happens if you can't quantify the uncertainty? And that's often the condition that we're in when we're doing a scenario analysis. Well, that's one of the reasons why we do scenario analyses. And if we're in conditions of deep uncertainty where you can't really quantify what's going to happen, and maybe it's difficult to really understand what sort of model should be applied to that sort of uncertainty, or what the sort of structure of the problem is, then uncertainty analysis isn't really appropriate, and that leads us then towards using some kind of alternative approach, such as scenario discovery or RDM, and sensitivity analysis can be part of that. So sensitivity analysis is then understanding what drives the model. You know, what's the influence of the inputs upon the outputs from the model. And one of the main proponents of sensitivity analysis, Saltelli, has identified these three sort of settings of sensitivity analysis. So firstly, understanding what drives the model, factor prioritization, or alternatively, you know, which of the inputs can you basically ignore because they don't really influence the outputs in the model at all. And then factor mapping, which is perhaps you're interested in a particular area of the output space, and you want to map that then to the combination of inputs that cause that particular desirable or undesirable outcome. Okay, next slide. So we wrote this sensitivity analysis paper for an audience of energy modelers, and if you're doing energy system modeling, you're probably quite familiar with a diagram like this, where you draw a sort of reference energy system showing your resources and how those are transformed by these boxes that represent technologies into some kind of demand, in this case, electricity demand. And you can think about a whole host of uncertainties, as Steve alluded to. They might be technological uncertainties in terms of how technologies perform. There could be fiscal, there could be uncertainties around the cost of capital or hurdle rates, how technologies might change over time, the efficiencies of technology, and then policies and so on. And the RDM framework allows you to really sort of distinguish between these different types of uncertainties and then think about whether what influence a policymaker has over those, or whether they just need to be managed. So most energy system models then represent basically a very simple sort of market And on the right-hand side, you can see a sort of picture, a pictograph of a supply curve, and then this a demand curve intersecting it. And it's worth thinking about what happens in an energy system model when you start changing then these uncertain parameters that influence the cost of technologies. And of course, what happens is this supply cost curve sort of changes shape. You can also think about what happens if demand increases or decreases. And in this case, the black demand line intersecting would just move up and down this supply cost curve. And so quite unexpected results can happen when you start moving or playing around with demand and technological parameters. And all of these things interact in quite complex ways, even in relatively simple models. And so sensitivity analysis, if we move on to the next slide, is one way to try and interrogate these models. To do that, as Steve said, you need some kind of workflow, and you need to be able to run the model many hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of times. And so that's what we've been working on in the Climate Compatible Growth Project, trying to build computational workflows into which you can plug an osmosis model in this case, and then perform a sensitivity analysis or perform scenario discovery as well. Next slide. So just some very quick results. So this is using an analysis of the model which I showed earlier in the diagram. So the first observation in this tiny results is you can see there's a space of just empty white down the bottom. And that's almost half the parameters in the model do absolutely nothing for the model results. So if you just click forward again, Laura, should get some zoom in of just the top section. The second observation is that, so I'm showing 3 different model outputs here. So the blue, orange, and green lines are 3 different outputs. The total cost of the energy system, total emissions over the whole model horizon, and then the proportion of renewable energy generation in the final model year. So each of these input parameters shown on the y-axis here, they influence the outputs in different ways. The most influential parameter for the total cost, for example, is the amount of demand, and that's fairly obvious. If you demand more electricity, then you need a bigger energy system, and that costs more in an optimization model. But for each of these outputs, there are actually relatively few inputs that cause most of the change in the outputs. And so it's clear here that you can really sort of simplify this model, and there is only a small number of levers, if you like, which actually cause most of the change in the outputs. Okay, next slide. So yeah, just to sum up, applying sensitivity analysis to these models is really informative. It shows that actually relatively few of the parameters can influence the model results, even when you're changing all of them over a whole range of uncertainty. So that can be quite surprising. The range of the inputs is really important. So what you mustn't do is just do a plus or minus 20% on all of the inputs. That will bias your sensitivity analysis results. And you can think, so how do you use sensitivity analysis? How could you integrate this into your sort of analysis? So if you're doing a classical scenario analysis where you want to present a small number of scenarios to stakeholders, then sensitivity analysis can allow you to identify the most influential parameters, which you should then include in your scenario analysis. And it also allows you to really simplify your model. If there are a whole range of technologies which don't influence the results at all, they can potentially be simplified or entirely, removed from your model. And then it's really important to identify what's an uncertain parameter and what's a sensitive parameter. And sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they're different. Okay, I think, and that's where I'll end. And just in the bibliography here, I've had links to the 2 papers, but also some tools which you can use to implement both RDM and sensitivity analysis.
Thank you very much, Will. Thank you very much for that presentation. Steve, thank you very much for that presentation. We will now move into a question session. And for that, we have Professor Mark Howells, who is going to lead these questions. Mark.
Mark, you're on mute.
Mark, you're muted.
Ira, maybe you want to kick us off?
Just saying, Mark is speaking, but his video is on, but he's muted. I can see him speak.
Can you unmute this? Yeah, sorry about that. We had a technical glitch. So the first question to Stephen, to Will, can you see RDM being used as a method to identify what investments in the future would be sensible investments and under what conditions? So often it's the case that we're presented with sets of scenarios that might represent different socioeconomic. They sketch out a nice envelope of potential solutions, but could we look at solutions and then reverse engineer under what conditions those solutions are sensible? So under what conditions would it be sensible to invest in wind, for example? Under what conditions would it be sensible to invest in solar or other options? So Will and then Steve, if I may. And for folk who are online, please do type in questions into the chat and we'll pick those up time permitting.
Yeah, so I can kick off. So well, yes. So the way you design an RDM study, or the quantitative side of it, it requires a bit of a mind shift in terms of a traditional modeling approach, because you're not just building a scenario in which something you want to explore whether one particular outcome happens, but you need to. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, there's some workman just walked straight in. Yeah, so sorry, Steve, would you mind taking over? I need to go and deal with this.
Yeah, sure. The trials of working at home. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, Mark. So I think what Will was starting to say was that, I mean, obviously in an RDM methodology, one is looking at a whole bunch of future conditions under which the system could evolve, and exploring kind of how various strategies stack up, whether that be sort of an investment strategy across a certain type of set of technologies or something else. So absolutely, I think it sort of provides that kind of basis for seeing when a set of investments in a given technology would make sense, and gives you a sense of what that world would look like. So would it be a world where certain the market was doing something with certain prices, or in terms of costs of technologies and so forth. So I think you can get some sort of really rich details of kind of, where your sort of robust strategy or set of robust strategies sit in terms of those different future conditions, and conversely those futures where you're vulnerable and you wouldn't make those kind of investments because it doesn't make sense. So yes, Will, did you want to pick back up on what you were saying, or should we move to the next?
I think let's move to the next question, Steve.
Right.
Oh, no, brilliant. Thank you. And Emil points out that we can use PRIM as a methodology for doing various tests in the space, which is well known. And thank you for sharing that to the group, Emil. I want to pick up one more question with respect to relevance for government planning. So in many countries, it's the case that presented with scenarios, the scenarios aren't helpful because you don't know what investment in there is particularly robust and under what circumstances it fits. So this is potentially a new method that's helpful. It's also the case in many government settings that you'll have to reconcile insights from different sectors that could involve various levels of complex modeling that takes place in different sectors. It could also involve wide levels of uncertainty. Could RDM be used and scenario analysis and the like be used as a method to help reconcile some of these differences and to provide some insights if one wanted to move away from just sector-specific plans into something that's more generally acceptable? So maybe I'd like to pose that one to Jairo, because I believe you've had experience doing similar in the Latin American context.
Yes, thank you, Mark, for that question. Yeah, I can actually start by saying that RDM is model agnostic. So this means that it can be executed using any different tool that is available out there. So in the particular case of the studies that have been executed in Latin America and the Caribbean, we've been adopting the open source energy modeling system, Osmosis. And this has been coupled with the whole robust decision-making methodology to actually explain different futures for those countries. I could start by saying also that in many cases, countries will have some tools developed in-house. So this basically helps calibrating the different tools or even including them into the analytical framework of RDM. So it is really a powerful tool in which you don't have to start from a scratch model. You don't have to develop the model, but you can actually use tools that are available in the country. So that actually helps increasing the empowerment in the country and increasing the political buy-in, as those tools may have been actually developed by the Minister of Energy, energy commissions, and other line ministers. So this basically means that we could use their tools, include those tools, develop it by experts in the country, and execute the whole RDM methodology that I was previously presenting. So yeah, I can comment on that.
Thank you very much, Jairo. I'd like to take the next two questions and combine them a little bit, or comments rather, from Emil as well as from Jürgen online. And please do put your comments and questions in the chat. That's helpful for managing the process. So Jürgen asks, how long would it typically take to go through the full RDM process? And in a related question, Emil asks, can you use robust decision-making to make decisions faster when you don't have access to perfect information or data and so on? And perhaps an add-on to that, can we do that in a sort of structured way? So maybe, Will, if I could pass that one to yourself.
I can mainly comment on the I guess the modeling component of RDM, which is just one part of this long pipeline. So maybe Jairo can talk a bit more about the entire process. But for the modeling, I think there are two sides to this. Firstly, the approach extends itself to developing small, simple models and then running them many hundreds or thousands or even more times. So the sort of modeling time might actually not take very long. On the other hand, if you try and apply a scenario discovery approach to an existing model which has a significant runtime, then you might end up taking a very long time to do this type of analysis. Yeah, so I think in terms of getting insights, then I think you can get a much sort of richer range of insights. You spend more time focusing on the sort of key uncertainties and really exploring that uncertainty space, rather than trying to develop a really incredibly detailed model which is locked to a very narrow part of the uncertainty space. And then maybe to Jairo for the broader question.
Thank you, Will. And I will second that comment, because sometimes the complexity of the model becomes a computational burden for the execution of the RDM. And it all depends on the computational power. But I could refer to the whole duration of the RDM, because RDM is not only getting a model and running it 1,000 times. It really starts with the co-creation aspects with the stakeholders, creating scenarios that are sensible and realistic for the country, and then feeding back the discussion with results that will help navigating the complexities of the strategy that the country is designing. That may take some time. It all depends on the country and the different political synergies in the country. So in this RDM guide that we are launching today, and I put the link previously in the chat for those that have joined us, this RDM guide suggests a duration of minimum 12 months to actually execute the 10 steps. So remember, it all starts with the first engagement with stakeholders. The analytical results, you get results, then you share results, then you get feedback, then you repeat the loop. And if you may recall that graph that I previously presented, that is repeated. In the cases of Latin America that I previously mentioned, this is normally repeated 3 times, so 3 workshops. This is not that it has to be 3 workshops all the time. It's just based on the experience in Latin America and the Caribbean, and some countries have actually be 2 or 4. So again, it doesn't have to be 3. It's just a recommendation from the practical guide based on the experiences of Latin America. So again, 12 months, but it could be a little bit more. Like in the case of Guatemala, so far we've been working with them for about 2 years now, co-creating with the different governments that they actually got over the last 2 years.
Thank you, Jairo. We're going to start to wrap up now. So maybe if I could ask Steve to answer one of the questions that he did in the chat, but I think it would be good to articulate this sort of what's the difference between normal uncertainty and deep uncertainty. Then maybe Will and Jairo, I could ask you just to add your closing statements. And I'd like to pick up one final point on communications. So over to you, Steve.
So on the deep uncertainty question.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of responded in the chat on that. I mean, I think the distinction comes from Lempert. I mean, who kind of sort of was really the sort of pioneer across these sorts of approaches. But it kind of, I think it's nice because it really sort of encapsulates some of the problems that we face as modelers. Like what's the right model to use? And I think I appreciated that Jairo mentioned that this is a sort of model agnostic approach, which I think is really important. So yeah, how do we represent the world in effect? What is the right model to do that? We have no real understanding of how to parameterize uncertainty and the distributions, we're not into we don't do forecasting here. We're doing kind of scenario building and looking for insights in future worlds. So we're not looking at risk, we're looking at uncertainty. And then so I think it's it's which models to use, it's the challenge of parameterizing that uncertainty, and then it's this issue of like, what matters to the stakeholders, in terms of priorities. And I think that's really where the sort of participatory part of this is so important, that different stakeholders can bring their own kind of ideas around priorities, etc., to the party, so to speak. So I think it kind of the RDM really well deals with that sort of deep uncertainty question as defined like that.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. So maybe last 30 seconds each from Will and Jairo.
Yeah, so the world is very uncertain, and I think as Steve showed, we often work in this place where we avoid really thinking about uncertainty, and I think what RDM does is it provides a way to really structure our thinking and apply that in a systematic way to engage with policymakers and have that discussion about the fact that the world is uncertain. We still need to make decisions based on, despite that. There are some things that we can control and some things that we can take advantage of uncertainty. There are opportunities as well as risks. And so, using this, we can get an upper hand basically and make much more effective decisions than if we just look at one very blinkered and narrow expectation of the world based on our biases and prejudices. I think don't be scared of uncertainty, and there are lots of tools and interesting ways to investigate it. And as I said, sometimes a simple model which really allows you to explore a whole range of uncertainties is much more appropriate and applicable and useful than something that's incredibly detailed and complicated but ignores uncertainty.
Thank you very much, Will. Jairo.
Yeah, I will second that comment, and will also add that we have to start deploying improved methodologies to plan our systems. The typical methodologies may actually fail to explore the different possibilities of the future. So robust decision making then becomes a powerful tool to address those challenges that we had before. And now with the computational power, we can actually start deploying robust decision making in a more frequent and regular basis in our studies. So embrace it.
Thank you very much, Jairo. I want to pick up on one final point that came in an anonymous comment in the very rich discussion that's been happening in the chat, and that was about communication. And I think it's a challenge to this community to be able to translate what we're doing in a way that helps policymakers understand that, as Will was saying, we might have a scenario that's blinkered and has a solution in it, but we have no idea if that's an optimal solution in just one case, or is it something that you can invest in and it's a very low regrets thing in many cases. And I think there's going to be a challenge to translate this into information that can be used well. I'd like to thank everybody for taking part in this seminar. A special thank you to our speakers, Jairo, Will, and Steve. And there'll be a recording of this, which we will make available on LinkedIn again. And much looking forward to engaging with the broader community, and grateful to be a part of that broader community. Thank you very much, everyone.